Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Walls. Amy counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps did not move. She pressed herself deeper into the shadowed alcove, her spine flattening against cold stone. The hidden door gaped behind her, an escape route she had mapped months ago, a passage that led to the old granary on the far side of the castle grounds. She had never used it. The risk of crossing the open courtyard outweighed the hunger that gnawed at her ribs. 4. 6. The footsteps resumed, slower now, deliberate. They climbed. Not toward her level, but toward the landing above. A man's voice murmured something, words she could not make out, then fell silent. Amy's fingers tightened around the knife's worn handle. She had killed a man with this blade, not in the fire, never in the fire, but afterward when a soldier had found her hiding in the wreckage of the east barn and decided to take what the flames had not consumed. The memory surfaced without permission. The crunch of cartilage, the hot spray across her palm, the way his eyes had gone wide with surprise rather than pain. She had not washed the blade for 3 days afterward. A torch flared to life on the landing above. The light spilled down the stairwell in a golden wedge, pushing back the darkness but also exposing the dust motes that swirled in its wake. Amy froze completely, barely breathing, her dark tunic blending with the shadowed stone. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Broad shoulders, tall, too tall for a servant. He wore no armor, but the cut of his coat spoke of wealth. He paused at the landing, one hand resting on the torch bracket as though he owned the very light itself. Then he turned his head. His gaze found the darkness where she crouched. Not the wall, not the floor. Her. "I know you're there," he said. His voice carried no alarm, no threat, only a strange, quiet certainty. "I've known for 3 weeks." Amy's blood turned to ice water. 3 weeks. She had been so careful. She had counted steps, memorized schedules, mapped the comings and goings of every servant and guard. She had believed herself invisible. The man descended a single step, then another. His face emerged from the shadow, a strong jaw, dark eyes that caught the torchlight, an expression she could not read. He stopped 3 steps above her, close enough that she could see the fine weave of his shirt, the silver thread at his cuffs. "I'm not going to call the guards," he said, "if that's what you're afraid of." Amy said nothing. Her knife stayed raised, the rusted blade catching a sliver of light. He gestured toward the passage behind her, toward the granary, the courtyard, the world outside these walls. "You've been stealing bread from the kitchen for 2 months. Never enough to notice, never enough to raise suspicion." A pause. "You're careful, smarter than most." The silence stretched between them like a bowstring. Amy's arm trembled, though whether from fear or exhaustion she could not say. "Who are you?" she whispered, the first words she had spoken aloud in 4 days. The man's expression shifted, something softened at the edges, though his eyes remained guarded. He descended one more step, bringing himself nearly to her level and crouched so that they stood eye to eye. "My name is Castian," he said, "and I think we have something to discuss." The kitchen swallowed sound like a living thing. Lord Castian Vale moved through the vaulted chamber, his boots finding the worn stones without hesitation. He knew these walls, the way they held heat from the ovens, the way the smoke had stained the rafters black generations ago, yet he had not walked these passages at night in years. The hour demanded solitude, and solitude demanded reason. He found it in the cooling racks. The rosemary loaves sat in neat rows, their crusts golden in the single torch's glow. His fingers hovered over the nearest loaf, then stopped. Something else claimed his attention, a gap in the stone wall where no gap should exist. A thin line of disturbed dust circled an old seam, nearly invisible to an unpracticed eye. Castian crouched, studying the wall with the focus of a man trained to notice what others missed. His hand traced the seam without touching it, feeling the faint draft that escaped from beyond. Someone had been using this passage. Recently. Repeatedly. He straightened, jaw tightening, the ghost in his walls. He had suspected, but seeing the evidence stirred something unwelcome in his chest recognition. He remembered hiding as a child, pressing himself into the narrow spaces behind the castle's inner walls when his father's voice grew too loud, when the corridors felt like they were closing in. He had understood what it meant to need a place that no one else knew about. Castian moved toward the oak table and sat. The wood bore the scars of decades' knife marks, burn rings, the faded impressions of countless elbows. He broke bread from one of the cooling loaves, the crust crumbling beneath his fingers, and poured wine from a pitcher left on the table. The goblet caught the torchlight, casting crimson reflections across the scarred surface. He waited. The kitchen settled around him, its iron pots gleaming like sleeping sentinels. The bread was fresh, still warm actually, as though baked within the hour. He tore another piece, chewed slowly, swallowed. The wine was decent, a red from the lower vineyards, not his preferred vintage but serviceable. The passage behind the wall remained still. He had not expected movement, not yet. Whoever used this route would be watching, waiting, assessing whether the kitchen was safe. He understood the calculus. He had made the same calculations himself, once. Castian took another sip of wine and let the silence stretch. The torch crackled softly in its bracket. Somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, a guard's footsteps echoed faintly, then faded. He was not calling for anyone. He had not told his steward, his housekeeper, or his captain of the guard. The knowledge lived only in his own mind, a secret kept for reasons he had not fully examined. The bread sat on the table between them, a silent offering, a gesture that said, without words, "I know you're there. I'm not your enemy." The darkness in the far corners of the kitchen remained undisturbed, but Castian did not leave. He sat with his wine and his patience, waiting for the ghost to decide whether to emerge. The wall shifted before she did. Amy pressed her spine against cold stone, feeling the draft that leaked through the seams she had worn smooth over months of careful passage. The kitchen lay before her, a cathedral of shadow and iron lit by a single torch that sputtered in its bracket. She had counted the seconds it would take to cross to the cooling racks. 4 heartbeats, maybe 5 if her legs remembered how to move after crouching so long. She emerged low, weight balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to sprint back into darkness if the room held anyone but sleep. The shadows favored her, they always had. 2 years of moving through Thorn Hollow's forgotten veins had taught her how to read darkness like a map. The bread sat on the table, loaves she had watched the bakers pull from the oven hours ago, still golden, still warm enough to smell from across the room. Beside them a goblet of wine caught the torch's glow like a drop of captured blood. Her stomach clenched. The hunger was a living thing inside her, clawing at her ribs. She had not eaten since yesterday's heel of stale bread, tucked into a corner of the servants' passage where the mice were kinder than the living. But someone sat at the table. Amy froze, her hand finding the knife at her belt. The figure did not move, did not turn, did not rise. He sat with the stillness of a man who had nowhere to be and all night to wait. Dark hair fell past his shoulders. His profile was sharp, angular, the kind of face that belonged in the portraits that lined Thorn Hollow's halls. She knew that face, or rather she knew the name that went with it. Lord Castian Vale. Her breath caught in her throat. The knife's handle bit into her palm. She could run back into the walls, back into the darkness that had become her world. She could disappear into the passage before he even stood. But he had not called the guard. He had not shouted, had not moved at all. He simply sat there, tearing bread with deliberate patience as if he were waiting for someone. "You have been taking bread from my kitchens for some time." His voice cut through the silence low even, carrying no anger. "Small amounts, careful amounts. I am not angry." Amy did not sit, did not lower the knife. Her jaw tightened until her teeth ached. "Why would you offer food instead of calling the guard?" The question came out rough, barely above a whisper. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, cracked from disuse, from nights spent silent in the walls. Castian turned his head then, finally looking at her directly. His eyes caught the torchlight, dark, steady, without pity or curiosity. Something flickered in them. Recognition, maybe, or understanding, because I believe you have a reason to hide. He gestured to the seat across from him. And because a lord who punishes hunger is a lord who has already lost something essential. Sit, eat, there is no trap here. The chair scraped against stone as she moved, not toward the door, not toward the wall, but toward the table. Her legs carried her forward despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The bread sat there like a test, like a question she did not know how to answer. She sat. Her fingers closed around the loaf, tearing a piece without tasting it. She chewed, swallowed. The bread tasted like survival, like the first real food she had eaten in weeks. She did not touch the wine. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Castian said nothing more. He drank from his own goblet, his gaze drifting to the window where moonlight pressed against the glass. The kitchen settled around them, iron pots hanging like sleeping sentinels, the torch's shadow dancing across the walls. Amy ate in silence, aware of his presence beside her like a warmth she had forgotten existed. For the first time in 2 years, she was not running, she was not hiding, she was seen. The corridors of Thorn Hollow looked different in daylight. Amy had only ever seen them at night, glimpsed through cracks in the walls or fleeting shadows as she moved between passages. Now she walked them openly, her bare feet silent on cold stone, her knife still at her belt but her hand not touching it. Castian moved ahead without looking back. He walked with the ease of a man who had never feared these halls, never had to memorize which floorboards creaked or which corners offered cover. Servants paused in their work as they passed, a scullion with stacked platters, a maid carrying linens, a stable hand with hay in his arms. Their eyes found Amy and lingered. She felt their gazes like fingers tracing her outline, cataloging her torn dress, her wild hair, the scar that ran along her jaw like a river through scorched earth. None of them spoke, none of them moved to stop her. That, more than anything, told her how thoroughly Castian had already decided this matter. Whatever game he played, whatever trap he was laying, the servants understood that she moved under his shield. She was not a thief to be dragged to the dungeons. She was something else, something they could not name but recognized as protected. They turned down a narrow passage she had never seen, past a door carved with vines so old they had worn smooth, and stopped before a wooden door reinforced with iron. Castian produced a key, turned it in the lock and pushed it open. The room beyond was small, smaller than the alcove she had slept in, the forgotten corners where she had curled into herself and pretended the cold was temporary. But it had a window, a narrow slit in the stone, covered now with heavy cloth, and a bed frame with no mattress, and a low wooden table that held a ceramic pitcher and a shallow basin. This room was prepared for a guest many years ago and has remained empty since. Castian's voice filled the space without echoing. It has a lock from the inside, for your security. Food will be brought daily. You will no longer need to steal. Amy stood in the center of the room, her body rigid, her mind racing through scenarios. Every kindness carried a price. Every open door had hinges that could swing both ways. Why the word came out flat, stripped of courtesy. What do you want from me? Castian did not answer immediately. He crossed to the window and pulled the heavy cloth aside, revealing the world beyond Thornhollow's walls. The moors stretched outward, a vast gray expanse of heather and stone, beautiful in its desolation, the early morning light catching the dew like scattered glass. 3 years ago, there was a fire on the northern estates. His voice changed, softer now, more careful. The Hurrow lands, a family died. The properties were seized by Lord Marinthide of Fa and absorbed into his holdings. It was all quite legal, according to the documents. Very tidy. Amy's breath caught. She did not move, did not speak, but there are inconsistencies in the records, gaps that suggest falsification. Castian turned to face her, his expression unreadable. I have been investigating quietly for some time. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Why do you care? The question was almost accusatory, her voice hardening despite herself. A lord seized land, laws were followed. That is how the world works. Castian's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not waver. Yes, that is how the world works, until someone decides it should not. He gestured toward the bed, the table, the closed door. I am offering you sanctuary and, if you are willing, partnership in proving what truly happened. The Harrowell fire was no accident, and I do not believe all of the Harrowell line perished. I believe someone survived. He paused, letting the words settle like ash. I believe that someone is you. Amy said nothing. Her hand moved to her belt, not to draw the knife, but to release it. The blade hung loose, her grip loosening with it, the smallest gesture of trust. Castian noticed, but did not comment. Before I go, he said, moving toward the door, my steward, Emrys Loden, will bring you fresh clothing and food at dawn and sunset. Morel Tom, the castle seamstress, will attend you if you have need. You may move freely within Thorn Hollow during daylight hours, though I suspect you will prefer the passages for now. The choice is yours. He paused at the threshold. What name should I use when I speak of you? Amy looked at the small chamber, at the locked door, the window, the bed that was hers alone for the first time in 2 years. Her throat tightened, her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. Amy. My name is Amy. It was the first time she had spoken her name aloud since the fire. Her voice did not break, but something in her face suggested that the act of naming herself to another person had cost her something essential. Castian nodded. Welcome home, Amy. When you are ready, we will speak of the fire. There is no rush. He closed the door quietly behind him, the lock clicking into place. Amy stood alone in her own space. Not a cell, but a threshold. The knock came at midday, 2 measured raps, unhurried. Amy had positioned herself by the wall, flat against the stone, her hand finding the knife hilt before her mind caught up with the reflex. The door opened a crack, and a man stepped through. He was older than the Lord, his hair close cropped and threaded with gray, his coat practical and worn at the elbows. Ink stained the pads of his fingers. Emrys Loden, steward of Thorn Hollow. He announced himself without flourish, his gaze settling on her face for only a moment before moving to the practical matters at hand. I've brought what you'll need. He set a bundle on the bed. Clothing, simple tunics and muted wool, a dark cloak, linen that looked soft with washing. A second bundle held candles, tallow and beeswax, and a box of flint. He placed these on the table beside the pitcher of fresh water. The Lord has instructed the household that you are to be treated with courtesy. Emrys's voice carried no curiosity, no inflection beyond the factual. Some staff will wonder, few will ask. Amy remained by the wall, watching him. He moved through the room with the efficiency of a man who had managed 1,000 small crises, adjusting the position of a chair, testing the window cloth, demonstrating the latch that secured the door from within. Meal times are dawn and sunset. I'll bring food myself, unless you prefer to take it in the hall. He paused. The library is 3 corridors east of the Great Hall. The Lord spends considerable time there. Records of all holdings are kept in the West Tower, but the library contains older documents, land grants, genealogies, things of that nature. The information hung in the air, offered without explanation. Amy understood. It was not an accident that he had mentioned the library. Candles are on the table, blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. Emery surveyed the room one final time, his expression neutral. If you need anything else, you need only ask. He left without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind him. The second knock came as the light through the window slit began to fade. This one was quicker, more insistent. The woman who entered carried an armload of fabric that she deposited on the bed beside Emrys's bundles. She was stout, her hair braided back with practical efficiency, her apron stained with the ghosts of dyes and thread. Her hands were calloused, and when she smiled, it reached her eyes. Morel Tom. I mend what needs mending. She surveyed Amy with an appraising look that contained no judgment. You need proper clothes, child, not the rags you've been wearing. She held up the deep green gown, letting it fall in a soft whisper of fabric. It was well made, the stitching fine, the color that of forest shadows. This was mended 3 seasons ago and never claimed, it will suit you. Amy opened her mouth to refuse, but Morel was already moving, crossing to the corner where a copper tub had been set, filling it from the pitcher with water she must have brought herself. Bathe first, then we'll see what can be done with that hair. The water was warm. Amy had forgotten what warmth felt like, warmth that did not come from walls pressed close, from her own body heat trapped in stone alcoves. She sank into the tub and let Morel work. The woman's fingers were gentle, working through the tangles that had become permanent fixtures, washing away the grime of 2 years. Amy hissed once when a knot pulled at the burn scar along her jaw, and Morel's hands softened, working around the damaged skin. You're the girl from the Herwell fire, aren't you? Morel's voice was low, practical, stripped of ceremony. Or at least, that's what I'm guessing. The Lord doesn't speak of such things, but he's been asking questions about those estates for months. Quietly. Amy said nothing. Her reflection in the copper tub rippled and broke. The world is not kind to those who survive when they're supposed to die. Morel's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. But kindness exists if you know where to look for it. By evening, Amy stood before the polished mirror that Morel had found and propped against the wall. The face that looked back was thin, the bones too sharp beneath skin that had not seen sun in months. The scar along her jaw was visible, a pale ridge that pulled at the corner of her mouth. But her eyes, pale gray, clear in the candlelight, were her own. The deep green gown hung from her shoulders, the fabric settling into place as if it had been made for her. Morel had been right. The color brought out something in her face that Amy had forgotten existed. She looked almost human again. A note waited on the table, folded once, sealed with a drop of dark wax. Amy broke the seal with a fingernail. Tomorrow, if you are willing, we will speak of records and facts, but only when you are ready. For now, rest. The castle will keep your secrets. The handwriting was careful, each letter formed with precision. Amy read it twice, then folded it and pressed it flat against her chest. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to consider that the offer might be genuine. She did not sleep well. Her body remained coiled, waiting for the sound of footsteps, for the crack of flame, for the moment when this kindness would reveal its teeth. But she slept in a bed, beneath a roof that was not made of stone and shadow, and the castle held its silence around her like a promise. Chapter 2. The Inciting Investigation. Amy asked the question, and the words hung in the dust-weighted air. Castian gestured toward the ledgers spread across the table. We start with what you know. The layout of the estate, buildings, storage rooms, escape routes. Any details you remember about the household, the staff, the timing of the fire. Amy moved to the table, her fingers hovering over the documents without touching them. The leather bindings were cracked, the pages yellowed at the edges. These were the records of her family's life, reduced to ink and accounting. The main house had 3 wings, she began, her voice steadier than she expected. East, where the textile storage was. West, where the servants slept. The central hall connected them both. My chamber was in the east wing, above the storage room. Emery's made a note on a separate sheet of parchment. The official inquiry stated the fire began in the textile storage. Do you know why that room specifically? Amy shook her head. It was where my mother kept the woven goods, tablecloths, tapestries, the winter cloaks for the staff. Flammable. Easily explained. But also easily acceleranted, Castian observed. He had moved to stand near the narrow window, his profile sharp against the pale light. If one wished to ensure rapid spread, the implication settled into the room like another layer of dust. Amy continued, each word pulling memory from where she had buried it. There were 12 household staff, 2 cooks, 3 maids, a groundskeeper, his assistant, a stable hand, my father's clerk, and 4 guards who rotated night watch. She paused. 9 survived. Emery's looked up from his notes. The inquiry listed 7 casualties. My father, my mother, my younger brother. Amy's throat tightened, the cook and his assistant, the night guard on duty in the east wing. 9 died, Castian repeated quietly, but you escaped. I was in my chamber. The window faced the outer garden. I climbed down the trellis. By the time I reached the ground, the east wing was already engulfed. She closed her eyes against the memory of orange light painting the night, the scream swallowed by roar. I ran. I did not stop running until I reached the passages beneath the castle. And you have been in the walls ever since, Castian said. It was not a question. 2 years. Emery's cleared his throat. The survivors, the staff who escaped, scattered after the seizure. Some went to other estates, others left the region entirely. He tapped his pen against the parchment. It may be possible to locate them, if they would speak. Would they? Amy opened her eyes. Marinthade's men were thorough. My father's clerk vanished entirely. The others were paid hush money, I assume, or threatened, perhaps both. Emery's expression was grim but determined, but people remember, and fear fades over time. If we can promise protection, the High Council will not protect them, Amy interrupted. Not against a lord with Marenthade's standing. Castian turned from the window. Then they will be protected under Thornhollow's authority. I will personally guarantee their safety. Amy studied him, this man who had found her in the walls, who had offered her a bed instead of a cell, who now promised to stand against a lord of the realm for the sake of a girl he had known for 2 days. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. You owe my family nothing. The Harrow lands are not your concern. Why risk your standing for me? Castian's gaze did not waver. Because I found you. Because I know what was done to your family, and I have the means to seek justice on behalf of those who cannot. Because it is right. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something more private, more vulnerable. And because I know what it means to be invisible, to have no one see you, to survive without being known. The silence that followed was different from the others, weighted with recognition, with the ghost of shared loneliness. Emerys cleared his throat, breaking the moment with practiced discretion. If I may suggest, we begin with the documents. Lady Hurwell has already identified discrepancies in the signatures and dates. There may be more. Meanwhile, I will compile a list of surviving staff and begin discreet inquiries. Castian nodded. And I will write to my contacts on the High Council. We will need allies when we present our case. Amy looked between them, at the steward with his careful methodicalness, at the lord with his quiet certainty, and felt something shift in her chest. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of its shape. I will need paper, she said, and ink. My memory is good, but I should write it down, everything I remember. Emery's produced a fresh quill and a stack of blank sheets from a nearby shelf. Take whatever you need, the archive is at your disposal. Amy sat down at the table, the green of her gown pooling around her like a reminder that she was no longer a ghost. She dipped the quill in ink, poised it above the first page, and began to write. The castle held its silence, listening. The embers in the great hearth had dimmed to a low orange glow, casting long shadows across the kitchen walls. Amy watched the light play across Castian's face as he tore the bread, noting how the shadows carved deeper lines around his eyes than she'd first realized. A man who carried weight, she thought. Perhaps had carried it for years. You have been remarkable, Castian said, offering the bread across the table. Your memory for detail, your ability to identify inconsistencies. I was right to see in you the person capable of rebuilding a case your family's enemies thought destroyed forever. Amy accepted the bread. The crust was warm, the inside soft, simple things that had become precious again. You believed me, even when I offered no proof beyond scars and fear. She touched her jaw, fingertips brushing the faded ridge. Most lords would have assumed I was a thief or a spy. I was taught, as a child, to listen to what the castle's walls remember. Castian's voice dropped, carrying something older than the present moment. There is a passage near my father's old study where I hid during a severe argument about duty and inheritance. I stayed there for hours, listening to footsteps, learning the patterns of the household. It taught me that secrets live in silence and that silence is never innocent. He paused. I suspect you understand that lesson as well. Amy nodded slowly. For 2 years, I learned every sound the castle makes. The way the stones settle at night, the rhythm of the kitchens, the footsteps of guards who never vary their patterns. Sound is survival when you cannot be seen. Something passed across Castian's face, a recognition that needed no words. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers. His fingers were warm, steady, and he did not grip, just rested there, giving her space to pull away if she wished. She didn't. You have survived long enough, he said. Now we must move toward justice. But I need to know, are you prepared for what that requires? Public testimony, your name spoken aloud in the Great Hall, facing Merinthide's denials and his lawyer's arguments? Amy looked at their joined hands. His strong fingers, her bird-thin wrist, scarred from years of scraping through tight passages. I spent 2 years hidden because I was afraid, afraid of being killed, afraid of being powerless, afraid of being forgotten. If I remain hidden now when I have the chance to restore my name and honor my family's memory, I am choosing that fear again. She met his eyes. I am prepared. Then tomorrow, we convene with the High Council's advocate, a woman named Margot Venn, who is sympathetic to cases of noble corruption. We will lay out what we have discovered and request a formal tribunal. Castian's jaw tightened slightly. Merenthide will fight this. He will claim fabrication, counter with his own falsified documents, demand that my neutrality be questioned. It will be ugly and prolonged, and if the council rules in his favor, then we will have failed, Castian said quietly, and you will remain in exile in your own ancestral land, your family's name erased, your birthright forfeit. He did not soften this truth. But that is not how this ends, Amy. We will not allow it. The certainty in his voice, not arrogance, but conviction, steadied something in her chest. She had spent 2 years learning not to trust hope. Tonight, across bread and candlelight, she allowed herself to believe that hope might be earned rather than destroyed. Hob lifted his head from near the hearth. The old hound rose slowly, joints creaking, and padded across the stone floor to Amy's side. He rested his graying muzzle on her knee, and his clouding eyes seemed to hold a quiet understanding. Scarred, imperfect, but steady. A creature that had survived injury, now offering comfort to a woman who had done the same. Amy placed her free hand on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The castle settled around them, its old stones holding their silence like a promise. The great hall of accountability smelled of old stone and cold ash, the remnants of fires lit long ago to warm council chambers now emptied of their usual purpose. Sunlight sliced through tall windows, catching dust motes suspended in the air like undecided thoughts. Margot Venn stood at the far end of the chamber, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing. She was 60 winters old at least, her gray gown severe, her posture that of someone accustomed to being believed. Castian laid the documents on the first table, ledgers, witness statements, the forged signatures Amy had identified weeks ago. His voice carried through the hall, measured and deliberate. He did not accuse. He presented facts, dates, inconsistencies, the documented presence of strangers on Harrowell grounds in the months before the fire. Margot listened with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When Castian finished, she turned to Amy. "You claim to be Amy Harrowell." The words were flat, procedural, presumed dead 3 years ago. "You offer your survival, your memory in these papers as proof." "I offer my presence," Amy said. Her voice didn't waver, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I escaped through the eastern servant corridor while the fire consumed the east wing. I was 17, my parents and my brother." She stopped, steadied herself. "I ran. I had no allies, no proof, no name that would be believed, so I hid." Margot's eyes narrowed. "And now I have seen what was done to my family's legacy. The seizure was too swift, too complete. The documents are falsified." Amy's voice strengthened. "I am asking the council to investigate the architect of that erasure." Margot nodded slowly, a flicker of approval crossing her stern face. "Your claim has weight, but the council will require more." "Witnesses who knew you before, documentation of lineage, something irrefutable." Morel Tom recognized her, Castian said. "Emery's Loden can confirm household details only a Harrowell heir would know. And I can attest to the genealogical records and the physical resemblance to her mother." Margot gathered her papers. "I will present this to the council. They will convene within the month." She paused, her sharp gaze moving between them. "Be warned, Marinthaid will not accept this quietly. Some council members will wish to protect their own arrangements," Castian said quietly. Margot's expression didn't change. "That is precisely why you must proceed." The balcony caught the last light of sunset, painting the moors in shades of gold and dying purple. Amy gripped the stone railing, feeling its cold solidity against her palms. Castian appeared beside her, silent at first. The wind carried the scent of heather and distant rain. "I am terrified," Amy said. "It wasn't weakness, just fact. You are also alive." His hand found hers in the fading light. "You survived when you were meant to be destroyed. That is not nothing. The estates are in decay, the lands have been neglected." She stared out at the horizon. "It will take years to restore them. I will help you." His voice was steady. "And when you are ready, I hope you will help me build something here that is not built on separation, but on partnership." Amy turned to face him, her scar catching the last light, her gray eyes steady. "Then let us rebuild together." Chapter 3. The investigation deepens. The cook's name was Bramble. She had worked in Thorn Hollow's kitchens for 30 years, her hands roughened by flour and her memory sharpened by decades of observing those who passed through the castle. Emrys found her in the scullery, scrubbing a pot with a determination that suggested the copper had personally offended her. "The man sat alone," she said, not looking up from her work. "Tall, dark cloak, hood raised. Paid in coin I'd never seen before, newly minted, bearing a crest I recognized." She finally met Emrys's eyes. Norenthide's crest. What did he ask? About the Harrowell estate, how many servants, whether the lady kept a large household, the layout of the east wing. Her voice dropped. I answered because he paid well. I did not know then what he intended. Emrys noted her words carefully, his handwriting precise despite the cramped quarters. Castian rode north through dying fields, the landscape growing wilder as he approached lands that had once borne the Harrowell name. The steward Morenthide had installed met him in a manor house that had once been prosperous. Now its windows were dark, its gardens overgrown. The previous staff were dismissed within a fortnight of the seizure, the steward said, his manner nervous. Lord Morenthide wished fresh administration. Fresh administration, Castian repeated. And were the previous staff given references, recommendations for new employment? The steward's silence was answer enough. Morel's network spread through the market town like threads in a tapestry. She bought cloth from a widow who had once served the Harwell household, traded gossip with a miller whose cousin had married into the estate staff, and finally, after 2 weeks of careful conversation, located the midwife in a cottage at the edge of the village. The old woman remembered. She remembered Amy's difficult birth, the mother's exhaustion, the father's joy at surviving twins. She remembered Edmund Harwell settling tenant disputes with patience, not force. She remembered the lady's name, Rosalie, and how she had sung to her children in the evenings. There was no reason, the midwife said, her voice creaking like an old door. No reason at all for what happened. Amy sat across from Emrys in the library, her memory flowing like water finding its natural course. She named the head gardener, Thomas Wren, and remembered how he had taught her to graft apple trees. She recalled the delivery routes, the seasonal income from wool and grain, the names of tenants who had worked the land for generations. With each detail, the portrait emerged, a household that functioned, that thrived, that had been torn apart not by its own failure but by external violence. Margot's search led her to a small house in a distant province, where an elderly man named Master Cordwain sat by a dying fire. I was not permitted to investigate fully, he said. His hands shook, but his eyes were clear. I was instructed that the fire was accidental and was removed from the site within a day. I protested, but I was warned in clear I have accredited my complicity ever since. Margot wrote his words in careful script, her seal affixed to the document. It was not enough alone, but it was a crack in the wall Merenthade had built. The fire crackled in the hearth as Castian read the letter for the third time, each word settling into his chest like a stone. Emrys stood by the door, his usual composure fractured by the tremor in his hands. The midwife has withdrawn. Morel went to speak with her this morning and found the woman in tears. 2 men had visited in the night. They did not threaten directly, just reminded her that she was old, that her grandchildren lived in the village, that accidents happened to those who spoke too freely. And Cordwain? The offer was more direct. 50 gold marks to recant. When he refused, they doubled it. He is frightened, my lord. He says he will not recant. But in Emrys paused. Fear makes men unreliable. Castian set the letter ablaze in the candle flame, watching the edges curl and blacken. Then we remove the opportunity for fear to make that choice for him. The midwife and her family will be brought to Thorn Hollow tonight. Assign guards to the transport. And Cordwain, send a rider with enough force to ensure his safe passage. He arrives by week's end. Emrys nodded, then hesitated. And Lady Harwell? If Merenthade is challenging her identity, she will not be harmed. Castian's voice carried the finality of a door sealing shut. Assign 2 guards to her chambers. She comes and goes only with escort. And inform Merrill Amy trusts her. Keep the seamstress close. The steward departed, leaving Castian alone with the dying light. He sat at his desk and pulled fresh parchment toward him. The quill hovered, then moved in steady strokes, to the honored members of the High Council in response to the petitions lodged by Lord Merenthade of Fa. The letter took shape, measured, precise, offering his recusal from the tribunal's judgment while refusing to surrender the investigation. He framed it not as defiance but as devotion to the process itself. If the council wished to judge fairly, they would have his evidence unclouded by his presence. If they wished to judge corruptly, they would have to do so in full view of the realm. He sealed the wax with Thorn Hollow's mark and set it aside. Tomorrow, the game would change. Tonight, he had laid his pieces. The fire dimmed, and Castian sat in the dark waiting for dawn. Amy held his gaze, her jaw set with the same determination that had kept her alive for 3 years in darkness. The candlelight flickered across her features, catching the pale scar along her jaw, the hollows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless doubt. Castian nodded slowly. Then we prepare. The tribunal convenes in 9 days. Margot will need your full testimony by the 5th day. We'll review every detail, every name, every moment you can recall. The more precise we are, the harder it becomes for Merenthade to pick apart. And if he finds more witnesses to silence, more men to visit in the night, he won't have the time. Castian's voice carried a quiet certainty. I've stationed riders at every road leading from Fa. Anyone who rides out with intent will be noted, traced, and intercepted. He is reacting now, not acting. That tells me something. Amy tilted her head, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her fear. What does it tell you? that he's cornered, that his foundation is cracking. A man with true power doesn't waste energy on intimidation, he simply commands. The fact that he's spending coin and effort to discredit you means your testimony frightens him more than anything else in this kingdom. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing by degrees. You sound very certain. I've learned to trust patterns, and the pattern here is simple. You survived when you shouldn't have, and that survival unravels everything he built. Amy moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold stone as she gazed out at the moonlit courtyard below. Her reflection stared back thin, weary, but unbroken. My father used to say that the truth is patient, that it waits behind lies until the lies exhaust themselves. Your father was wise. He was also dead before the sun rose the next morning. Her voice cracked just slightly before she steadied it. I'm not sure patience served him well. Castian joined her at the window, standing close enough that their sleeves nearly touched. Then we'll be impatient for him, for all of them. A servant's footstep echoed in the corridor outside, quick, purposeful, and then faded. The castle breathed around them, its ancient stones holding secrets as old as the hills, and Amy realized she no longer felt like a ghost moving through them. The documents, she said quietly. Cordwin's deposition. It's thorough. He details the pressure, the threats, the sealed orders that bypass standard inquiry, but there's a gap in the timeline. 3 days between the fire and the official investigation. What happened in those 3 days? Castian's expression sharpened. That's what we've been missing. I've sent men to the regional archives, anything that might have passed through the capital in that window. Letters, warrants, travel logs. And if we find something, then Marinthide's entire operation collapses. Not just the seizure, there's no way to do that, but the conspiracy itself. Everyone who aided him becomes complicit, and the council will have no choice but to act. Amy turned from the window, resolve hardening in her expression. Then we find it. The morning light fell pale and thin through the high windows of the archive, casting long shadows across the scattered ledgers. Emery sat alone at the work table, his fingers resting on a single piece of parchment that had grown soft and faded at the edges from years of handling. He had found it tucked behind a false panel in the records room, wedged between two property deeds from the Fa Holdings, a receipt. His signature, still legible after 15 years, though the ink had browned with age. The amount was modest, not enough to live on, but enough to notice, enough to sway a young clerk who had just begun his rise through the castle's ranks. The transaction had been simple. Endorse a land claim that carried suspicious credentials, look the other way, accept the coin. He had told himself it was a minor thing, the claim would have been approved regardless. His signature was a formality, nothing more. But the claim had been dubious, and his signature had lent it legitimacy for a crucial season. By the time the truth emerged, the damage had settled like sediment in still water. Emery's pressed his thumb against the parchment, feeling the texture beneath his skin. The guilt had never quite left him. It had simply grown quieter, buried beneath years of meticulous work and careful neutrality. The archive door swung open, and Amy's footsteps crossed the stone floor. She had taken to visiting the chamber each morning now, reviewing documents, preparing for the tribunal. Her green gown caught the weak light as she approached, her dark red hair pinned back neatly. Emery's, she stopped at the table's edge, her gaze moving from the receipt to his face. Is everything all right? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he laid the parchment flat, smoothing its creases with deliberate care. I need to show you something. Amy sat across from him, her expression patient but watchful. She had grown bolder in the weeks since arriving at Thorn Hollow, her spine straight, her eyes clear. She no longer flinched at sudden movements or looked for exits upon entering a room. Emery's explained. The transaction, the signature, the 15 years of carrying the weight of a choice made in weakness. His voice remained steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. I have spent 15 years trying to be meticulous, trying to be righteous, trying to compensate for that moment of weakness, he said quietly. I did not fully succeed until you arrived. Your presence, your survival, your refusal to remain hidden, it forced me to confront that compromise again. To ask myself what kind of man do I choose to be now when the opportunity for real justice is before me. Amy held his gaze. What kind of man do you choose to be, one who speaks truth no matter the cost? Emery straightened, his composure settling back into place, but now with something added, a clarity that came from having faced himself. I have prepared a complete account of my investigation into the Harrowell seizure. Every document, every inconsistency, every lead. I am prepared to testify before the council to explain in detail how Marinthide falsified records and orchestrated the fire, and I will accept whatever consequences follow from my involvement in this action. There may be no consequences, Amy offered. If the council believes us, if justice is served, and there may be severe consequences, Emery's interrupted gently. If the council protects Marinthide, if my involvement is deemed improper, I could lose my position, my reputation, my ability to serve in any noble household. I understand that risk, and I accept it. He looked at Amy directly. This is what courage looks like, I think. Not the absence of fear, but the acceptance of risk because something larger than your own safety requires it. Amy nodded slowly, her expression unreadable but her presence solid, present. She reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over his, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than comfort. Then we prepare, she said. Together. Emrys looked down at her hand, then back at the receipt still lying between them. The guilt remained, it would likely always remain, but it no longer held the same power. He had chosen his path. The castle hummed with purpose. Corridors that had once echoed with silence now carried the footsteps of messengers, the rustle of parchment, the low murmur of strategy. Master Cordwain arrived first, escorted by two of Castian's most trusted soldiers, his face pale but resolute. The midwife followed a day later, her grandchildren safely installed in Thornhollow's guest quarters under Emers's watchful eye. Margot Venn occupied the library with her legal team, spreading evidence across every surface until the room resembled a war chamber, ledgers stacked beside maps of the Harrowell estates, depositions pinned beneath candlesticks to keep them from curling. Morel worked in Amy's chamber, her needle flashing in the afternoon light as she stitched the deep blue gown. The fabric was fine wool, dyed with woad and lichen, the color of winter twilight, regal without shouting for attention. She told Amy stories as she worked of Lady Harrowell before the fire, who had once interceded when a tenant farmer's crop failed, convincing the then lord to defer rents. Of the household's reputation for fairness, for taking in travelers during winter storms. Your grandmother hosted the harvest feast for 3 villages, Morel said, her voice soft but certain. Your mother continued that tradition. The name Harwell meant something beyond land and title. It meant shelter. Amy watched the needle rise and fall, watching the fabric take shape. The gown would be her armor tomorrow, not steel but something subtler. The assertion of lineage, of belonging to a tradition of justice and care. The sun hung low by the time Amy made her way to the balcony. Castian stood at the railing, his profile sharp against the crimson and gold of the sunset, the heather below burning with color. He turned as her footsteps sounded, and something in his expression softened. Tomorrow, Amy said, joining him at the railing, watching the light paint the moors in shades of fire. I will stand before the High Council and demand that my family's name be restored. I will accuse a lord of murder and conspiracy. I will offer my survival as proof of his guilt, and you will be magnificent. He stood beside her, close enough that their hands almost touched. You have already been magnificent simply by surviving. Tomorrow, you will be magnificent in a public light. Amy turned to face him fully, her scar visible in the evening light, her gray eyes holding both fear and determination. If the council rules against us, if they believe Mawynthid and dismiss my claim, I will have revealed myself for nothing. I will have lost the sanctuary of shadow without gaining justice. Yes, Cassian acknowledged, not softening the truth. That is the risk you take by stepping into the light. But I believe, no, I am certain that the evidence we have gathered is too solid to be dismissed. The council may be compromised by self-interest, but they will struggle to deny simple facts. He paused, his tone shifting into something more personal. And even if they do deny those facts, even if justice is not served tomorrow, you will have spoken your truth. You will have reclaimed your voice. That cannot be taken from you. Amy reached for his hand and he accepted the touch. When this is finished, whatever the outcome, I want to know who you are beyond the Lord of Thornhollow. I want to know the child who hid in passages and learned to listen to stone and silence. I want to know the man behind the control and the certainty. And I want to know the girl who survived fire and became a woman capable of demanding justice from power. Castian responded softly. But first, we must finish this reckoning. And then, if you are willing, we will have time to truly know each other. He kissed her then carefully, as if asking permission with his lips before taking what he wanted. Amy responded by drawing him closer, her hands gripping his shoulders, tasting wine and candlelight and the particular peace that came from being fully seen by another person and chosen anyway. When they broke apart, Castian whispered, "You are not alone in this, Amy. You have never been alone in this, no matter how it felt in the darkness." Amy nodded against his chest and allowed herself, for the first time since the fire, to believe that perhaps safety and justice were not mutually exclusive. Perhaps they were simply two parts of the same transformation. Chapter 4. The tribunal convenes the Great Hall of Accountability, fell silent as the herald's staff struck the stone floor 3 times. The sound echoed through the vaulted chamber, bouncing off banners that bore the sigils of 12 houses, each one a vote that could restore or destroy a name. On this day, the 14th of the autumn moon, the High Council of the Realm convenes to hear charges against Lord Marinthaid of Fa, the herald announced, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of ritual. Conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit murder, falsification of legal documents, fraudulent appropriation of noble estates, obstruction of justice in the original inquiry. The words settled over the assembly like a weight, whispers died in throats, even the torch flames seemed to still. Margot Venn rose from her table, her documents arranged with geometric precision. She spoke without notes, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who had spent decades navigating the corridors of legal power. She laid out the ledgers first, the suspicious payments made to contractors in the months before the fire, the transfer documents bearing signatures that did not match the originals, the dates that conflicted with official records. She presented each piece without embellishment, letting the inconsistencies speak for themselves. Then came the witnesses. Master Cordwain climbed to the stand with the careful steps of a man who had outlived his strength but not his conscience. He spoke of the original inquiry, of the pressure placed upon him to rule the fire accidental, of the men who had visited his office with offers he could not refuse. His voice trembled, but his words did not. The midwife followed, her hands weathered by decades of bringing children into the world. She described the Herwill household as she had known it, prosperous, orderly, marked by no desperation that would force the sale of land. She spoke of births she had attended, of a family that paid fairly and treated tenants with consideration. Morel Tom took the stand next. Her needle-pricked fingers folded in her lap. She described recognizing Amy. The resemblance to her grandmother, the scar on her jaw that matched a childhood fall documented in household records. She spoke of conversations they'd shared, of knowledge only a Herwell could possess. Emrys Loden presented the archival evidence last, his voice steady despite the weight of what he revealed. He walked the council through the chronology of falsification, explaining precisely how documents had been altered and when. His testimony carried the authority of a man who had spent his life verifying truth. When Margot Venn turned toward the doorway where Amy waited, the hall held its breath. The Crown calls Amy Herwill to testify. Amy rose from her seat and walked to the center of the great hall. The deep blue gown Morel had crafted moved with her, its fabric catching the light from the torches mounted along the walls. Her scar was visible against her pale skin, a dark line running along her jaw that had faded to white over 3 years of hiding. Her gray eyes swept across the assembled council members, 12 faces judging her survival. Margot Venn began with basic questions: name, family lineage, birth date. Amy answered each with clear precision, her voice carrying through the vaulted chamber without wavering. She named the head gardener, Thomas Wren, who had tended the rose gardens for 30 years. She described the library's exact layout, the placement of the reading alcove where she had spent her evenings, the route of the servant stairways that wound through the manor's walls. Details only someone raised within those walls would know. Then Margot turned to the fire. Tell the council what you remember of the night the Herwell Manor burned. The great hall fell silent. Observers stopped shifting in their seats, stopped breathing, stopped whispering. Even the torch flames seemed to still. Amy drew a breath. I was in the library, reading. It was late evening, the household was preparing for sleep. I was 17 years old and had no premonition of what was coming. She paused, and for a moment her composure flickered like a candle in wind. Across the hall, Castian stood apart from the crowd, his body tense, his hands curled at his sides. He did not move, but every line of him radiated silent support. I heard shouting from the east wing. Then I smelled smoke. Not the smoke of a hearth or kitchen, but something acrid and deliberate. Amy's voice steadied. I went to the corridor and saw flames already consuming the eastern stairway. My parents' chambers were in that direction. Did you attempt to go to them? I tried. The word came out rough, but the flames had already cut off the main stairway. I ran back toward the servants' passages. My father had shown me them as a child, in case of emergency. I made it through the library's hidden door and into the passages beyond. I ran downward, toward the exterior. She touched her jaw, a reflex. As I passed through the main kitchen passage, I ran into a beam that had fallen from an upper level. The beam was already burning. It struck my face. That is where this scar came from. The scar was visible in the bright light of the great hall, its shape and severity undeniable. Pain was evidence. The council members shifted almost imperceptibly, a collective acknowledgement of what the mark meant. And you made it outside. I made it outside and into the storm. I ran into the moors and did not stop until I could no longer see the light of the fire behind me. Amy's voice dropped quieter. I did not know if my parents had survived. I did not know who had ordered the fire. I knew only that our family's enemies had finally acted and that I was alone. How did you come to Thornhollow Castle? I wandered for 2 days. I was injured, burned, terrified. I found the castle's outer passages by accident and entered them seeking shelter. Over the course of 2 years, I learned the castle's rhythms and survived by taking small amounts of food. I would have remained hidden forever, but Lord Castian Vale discovered me in the kitchens and offered sanctuary instead of punishment. He has been investigating the Harwell fire since he discovered evidence of falsification in the land transfer documents. His investigation is what has brought me to testify today. Margot paused, her sharp eyes scanning the counsel. Lady Amy, the defendant's counsel will likely argue that you are not truly Amy Harrowell, that you are a fabrication or an impostor placed by Lord Vale to challenge their client's legitimate ownership. How would you respond to such an accusation? Amy stood straighter, her shoulders back, the weight of her title settling around her like armor. I would say that my survival is not convenient. It is not advantageous to the defendant's narrative of legitimate succession. I would say that this scar is real, that my knowledge of the Harrowell household is real, that the love I bear for my family and the injustice done to them is real. She met the eyes of the council members directly, one by one, letting each see the truth in her gaze. I have spent 3 years as a ghost. I have hidden in walls and shadows because I was afraid. But I am alive. My family is dead, murdered to clear the path for Marinthade's theft, and I am asking you, as representatives of justice in this realm, to acknowledge the truth that I survived to tell. The great hall held its silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. No one moved, no one spoke. Then Margot turned toward the defendant's table, where Marinthade's counsel sat rigid with barely contained anxiety. Your case. Chapter 5. Justice and Homecoming. Marinthide's counsel rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his formal robes. He was a lean man with a voice like polished stone, smooth, deliberate, designed to persuade. The prosecution has presented a collection of documents and testimonies. But documents can be forged, memories can be shaped by leading questions. A scar, however tragic, could come from any number of accidents in a castle this old. He paused, letting the words settle. My client acquired the Harrow lands through lawful transfer. The original inquiry ruled the fire accidental. To suggest otherwise requires believing that every official who reviewed the case was either complicit or incompetent. He called his first witness, a clerk from the regional archive who testified that the land transfer documents bore proper seals and signatures. The man's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and he referenced his records more often than seemed necessary. The second witness was a councilman from the original inquiry, an elderly lord who insisted the fire's accidental nature had been self-evident. The Harrow estate was old, wooden beams, textile storage. These things happen, but Margot's cross-examination exposed the fragility of their claims. She asked the clerk about the dates on the documents. He admitted the timestamps had been added after the fact. She asked the councilman whether he had visited the site. He had not. The defense called 2 more witnesses, a steward from Fa and another clerk. but their testimony required the council to believe that suspicious payments were mere coincidence, that falsified records simply appeared, that a dozen separate anomalies happened to favor Mayenthade without any coordination. Throughout it all, Lord Marinthade himself sat motionless at the defendant's table. He did not take the stand. He did not speak. His silence spoke louder than any witness could. When the defense finally rested, Margot stood for her closing statement. The prosecution does not ask you to believe in villainy, she said, her voice cutting through the hall. We ask you to count. Count the suspicious documents. Count the corrupted witnesses. Count the strangers seen on Harrowell grounds days before the fire. Count the convenient deaths. Count the speed of seizure. She turned briefly toward Marinthade. Count the coincidences. The accumulation is not evidence of misfortune, it is evidence of method. The council's duty is not to believe or disbelieve, but to weigh, and the weight is undeniable. The council deliberated for nearly an hour. When they returned, the head councilman stood with the sealed scroll. The vote is 8-4. He broke the seal. This council rules that Lord Marinthade of Fa engaged in conspiracy to commit arson and murder, falsified legal documents, and fraudulently appropriated noble estates. The original inquiry is hereby declared corrupted and its conclusions invalid. The hall erupted in murmurs. Amy stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. Across the room, Castian's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension draining from his frame. The door opened without announcement. Castian stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the corridor's dim light before he closed it behind him. The room held only candlelight, casting amber pools across the stone walls and leaving the corners in shadow. Amy sat on the edge of the bed, still dressed in the blue gown from the tribunal. Her shoulders curved inward, her spine curved as though the weight of the day's proceedings had finally found its mark. She did not look up when he entered. Castian had expected, perhaps hoped, to find her relieved, vindicated, even quietly proud. Instead, he found tears tracking down her face, her chest heaving with sobs that seemed to tear through her without sound. "We won," he said softly, crossing to sit beside her. The mattress dipped under his weight. "The council ruled in your favor. Your family's name is restored. Marinthade has been stripped of his title and lands. Justice was served. My family is still dead." Her voice cracked on the words, raw and broken. "Winning does not bring my mother back. It does not restore my brother. It does not undo the arson or the conspiracy. My parents were murdered 3 years ago, and all that I have won is the knowledge that their murderer has been publicly shamed and stripped of stolen property." Castian said nothing. He simply pulled her against him, one arm wrapping around her shoulders, and held her while she wept. Her body shook against his chest, years of held grief finally breaking free. He understood that this was not weakness, this was the cost of surviving. The candles burned lower, shadows shifted across the walls, and gradually Amy's sobs quieted into shuddering breaths, her fingers curling into the fabric of his sleeve. "I have built my entire survival around the goal of proving what happened to my family," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "And now that I have achieved it, I do not know who I am without that goal. I do not know what I am supposed to do with the rest of my life." Castian tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You will rebuild. You will restore the Harrowell estates to honor your family's memory. You will create a life that is not centered on survival or revenge, but on the simple act of living, of building, creating, loving." He paused, searching her face. "And if you are willing, you will do some of that building here, with me. I am terrified." Her whisper barely filled the space between them. "I have been terrified for so long that I do not know how to be anything else. What if I fail at living? What if I fail at love? Then we will fail together," Castian said simply. "But we will not fail in trying." The morning brought a formal summons from the High Council. Amy, dressed carefully in the green gown Morel had made, its color a declaration of survival, and rode to the capital with Castian at her side. The council chamber felt different this time, less like a courtroom and more like a threshold. The Lord Chancellor read the formal restoration lands, property, compensation extracted from Marinthide's holdings, a material acknowledgement of the injustice. When they placed the sealed documents in her hands, Amy felt the weight of paper and ink, the weight of 3 years of silence finally given voice. They rode north the following dawn. The moors stretched wide and austere, the landscape bare except for heather and stone. Amy had forgotten how vast the territory was, how the wind moved across the land like something alive. Castian rode beside her, offering silence when silence was needed, his presence steady as the horse beneath him. The manor appeared on the horizon as a scar against the sky. She had known what to expect. The tribunal had described the damage, words had prepared her. But nothing had prepared her for the sight of it. The eastern wing collapsed into blackened ruin, stone charred and beams fallen like broken bones. The western wing stood but barely, windows punched out, doors swinging in the wind, interior exposed to years of rain and snow and neglect. Amy dismounted in the courtyard and simply stood there. Castian dismounted beside her, giving her room. The wind carried the smell of damp stone and old ash. She walked to where the front entrance had been, now a mouth of darkness, and pressed her palm against the doorframe. The wood was rotted, soft under her fingers. I want to restore it. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I want to rebuild the manor, restore the lands, and make the Harrowell estates prosperous again. Not to erase what happened, but to honor those who did not survive to see it. Castian stepped beside her. Then we will begin. The work started within the week. Master masons arrived from the southern towns, surveying the eastern wing and calculating materials. Carpenters examined the western structure, cataloging what could be saved and what must be replaced. Amy walked the grounds with agricultural experts, discussing drainage and crop rotation and the restoration of farmland that had lain fallow for 3 years. Emrys managed the finances with his usual precision. Maigatyamu do Diludzayan, ensuring every expenditure served the restoration. He had extended his role beyond what anyone expected, and Amy suspected he had no intention of returning to Thorn Hollow permanently. His regret over the old receipt had transformed into purpose. Varel arrived with a network of connections, former servants, displaced workers, people who knew how to build a household from nothing. She interviewed candidates for staff, selecting those with skill and loyalty over pedigree. The Harile name meant fairness, she told Amy one evening over tea in the ruined kitchen. Your grandmother paid fair wages. Your mother did the same. We will rebuild that reputation. Master Cordwain requested an audience with Castian before the week ended. The elderly investigator stood straighter than he had in months, his eyes clear. I wish to remain at Thorn Hollow as a permanent advisor on matters of legal and documentary accuracy. Castian agreed without hesitation. Cordwain nodded once, then added, There are younger scribes who need teaching. The work of truth requires apprentices. The midwife returned to her market town, but she carried something new with her, the knowledge that her words had mattered, that truth spoken quietly could topple powerful men. She became a local legend, the woman who helped restore a family's name. Amy stood in the courtyard as the sun set over the northern lands, the ruins behind her and the future spread before her. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was a woman standing in the wreckage of her old life, beginning the work of building something new. The great hall of Thorn Hollow had been transformed for the ceremony. Banners bearing the Harrowell crest, 3 silver oak leaves on a deep green field, hung alongside those of the surrounding noble houses, a public declaration that the name once erased now held its place among them once more. Amy walked the length of the hall in procession, her footsteps echoing against stone that had witnessed countless judgments and declarations. The gown Morel had crafted for her fell in heavy folds of emerald silk, the color of the first garment she'd been given when she emerged from the walls, but transformed now into something worthy of a title. Her scar traced a pale line along her jaw, visible to every eye in the hall. She had stopped covering it weeks ago. Castian walked beside her, his stride measured to match hers. His dark wool doublet bore the veil crest, and his presence at her side carried weight the court understood. The Lord of Thorn Hollow had not merely sheltered a survivor, he had staked his reputation upon her cause. The whispers that had followed them since the tribunal spoke of alliance, of partnership, of something deeper than political calculation. At the dais, the Lord Chancellor rose from his seat. The assembly fell silent. By the authority of the High Council and in accordance with the tribunal's verdict, the title of Lady of the Harrowell Estates is hereby restored to Amy Harrowell, daughter of Edmund and Catherine Harrowell, heir to the Northern Holdings. The Chancellor's voice rang out, carrying to every corner of the vaulted chamber. All lands, properties, and compensation are returned to her name, effective this day, and entered into the public record. The sealed documents were placed in Amy's hands. She felt the weight of them. Not merely paper and wax, but the substance of 3 years of silence finally given form. Then the assembly turned expectantly toward her. Amy stepped forward, her pulse steady despite the hundreds of eyes upon her. 3 years ago, fire destroyed my family's home and killed those I loved. I was left alone, bereft of title, name, and safety. For 2 years, I hid in the spaces between walls, uncertain if I would ever reclaim the identity that was stolen from me. Her voice carried to every corner of the great hall. Today, I stand before you as Lady Amy Harrowell, restored to my name and my estates. This restoration is not a gift from justice, but a correction of an injustice that should never have occurred. She paused, gathering herself. I stand here because others chose to act. Lord Castian Vale, who discovered me and offered sanctuary instead of punishment. Steward Emery's Loden, who risked his position to uncover falsified documents. Morel Tom, who offered practical kindness when I had nothing else. And the witnesses who spoke truth despite the risk to themselves. Her gaze swept across the assembled lords and council members. I ask that this moment, this public acknowledgement of restored justice, serve as a reminder that power without accountability is tyranny, and that justice is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right that must be demanded and defended by all of us. Silence held the hall. Amy stood motionless, her hands folded before her, the weight of the document steady in her grip. Then slowly, members of the assembly began to rise. Not all at once, different lords and ladies stood at different moments, some exchanging glances, some simply moved by what they had witnessed. But the gesture spread until enough had risen that it became unmistakable, a standing acknowledgement that transcended legal obligation. It was the response owed to courage. The formal proceedings are complete. Marinthad has been stripped of his titles and lands, effectively exiled from the kingdom's noble structure. The Harrell estates are being steadily restored, with the first season of reconstruction completed and plans for expanded rebuilding already underway. Amy has split her time between overseeing the restoration work and remaining at Thorn Hollow, creating a rhythm of presence and absence that neither she nor Castian wishes to formalize into something rigid. Amy leans against Castian, her body relaxed in a way it was not in the early days of their acquaintance. I have been thinking about what comes next, she says quietly. The Harral estates will require years to fully restore. The lands are recovering, but slowly. I have decided not to live there full time, not yet. The manor house is being rebuilt, but it is still a construction site. She pauses. I have also been thinking about what I want my life to be, beyond restoration and recovery. And Castian prompts gently. I realize that I have never allowed myself to want anything beyond survival. Everything I have done in the past 3 years has been in service to the goal of reclaiming my identity and proving what happened to my family. Now that I have achieved that goal, I do not know how to be someone who simply lives. She turns to face him. I want to learn. I want to help manage Thorn Hollow. I want to build something here that is not born from secrecy or necessity, but from choice and partnership. Castian takes her hand, and Amy notices, as she has many times in recent weeks, how natural the gesture has become, how little it requires now to cross the distance between them. I want that as well, he says. I have spent my life managing this castle alone, believing that isolation was necessary for clear judgment. But you have shown me that partnership and accountability are not threats to clear judgment. They are what make judgment meaningful. What happens to the passages? Amy asks suddenly. The hidden spine where I survived? Does it become forgotten again? Castian considers the question seriously. I had thought to seal them, to restore the castle's structure and eliminate the vulnerabilities that allowed you to survive unseen. But now I think the passages should remain. Not as hiding places, but as reminders. Reminders that safety is not something that can be enforced from without, but something that must be built from within. By choosing to see those who hide, to offer shelter to those who need it, to transform walls into bridges rather than barriers. Then I would like to help design what the passages become, Amy says. Not hidden anymore, but also not fully public. Places where people can move privately, but not secretly. Places where movement is acknowledged but not judged. Castian pulls her close, and Amy rests her head against his shoulder, watching the last light fade from the moors. I love you, he says quietly. I do not know when that love began, perhaps when I discovered you in the kitchen, or when I offered you sanctuary, or when I watched you testify before the council. But I know that it is true and complete, and that I want to spend years discovering who you become as you move beyond survival and into simply living. Amy turns to face him, and in the last light of sunset, her scar is barely visible, her face peaceful. I love you as well, and I want to rebuild, not just the Harrowell estates, but a life, here, with you, in this castle that has become sanctuary instead of fortress. She kisses him then, with all the certainty of someone who has learned through trauma and resilience that love is not a threat to be feared, but a gift to be accepted. Hob rises, his three-legged gait steady, and moves between them, leaning his aging body against their legs. A benediction. A simple statement that wholeness is possible even in imperfection, that family is something chosen and built, not something inherited or bestowed. Amy traced her fingers along the restored stone wall, feeling the difference between the old and the new. The ancient mortar had been carefully repointed, the crumbling sections rebuilt using matching quarries. The masons had done their work well, honoring what existed rather than replacing it entirely. The corridor stretched before her, wide enough for two people to walk comfortably, lit by windows whose glass had been replaced after years of neglect. Through them, the afternoon sun cast warm rectangles across the flagstones. She could hear the distant sounds of the castle working around her, footsteps, voices, the clatter of cartwheels in the courtyard beyond. The new library wing is nearly complete, Castian said, appearing at the corridor's end with rolled papers in his hands. Master Cordwain estimates that the archival collection can be transferred within the month. He has trained 3 young scholars in his methods. They are already proving more capable than he is at the actual physical work, though he remains invaluable for interpretation and guidance. Amy took the plans he offered, spreading them across a newly installed reading table. The Harrowell estate spread across the parchment in careful detail, fields, farms, the slowly rebuilding manor at the center. What had begun as simple restoration had become something larger. And Emery, she asked, how is he managing the dual administrative responsibilities? Remarkably well. Castian's mouth curved. He has moved into the North Territories 2 days each week to oversee the Harrowell household management directly. He says it is keeping him younger than he would be if he remained here. I suspect he and Morel are planning something, Amy said. As do I. Though neither has confirmed it. The sound of brisk footsteps announced Morel before she appeared around the corner, her apron dusted with thread clippings, her braids neat despite the day's work. The ceremony preparations are complete, she reported. The great hall will be decorated by evening. The feast preparations are underway. Guests have begun arriving. Amy folded the plans carefully. Thank you, Morel. You'll want to change soon, Morel added, her gaze lingering on Amy's practical clothes with gentle criticism. The guests will expect Ray let her wear what she chooses, Castian interrupted quietly. Morel's expression softened. Of course. I'll see to the rest. That evening, candles burned in the great hall, their light catching the flowers woven through the rafters. The assembly gathered household members, council supporters, local folk whose lives had improved with the estate's recovery. Amy stood beside Castian at the head of the room, her green gown simple but dignified. I commit to partnership, Amy said, her voice steady, to shared stewardship, to building something that honors what was lost and creates what can be chosen. Castian took her hand. I commit to the same. Together. Before them, Hob rose from his place by the hearth, gray-muzzled now, his movement slower, and walked between them, pressing his scarred body against their legs. The three-legged hound sat, his breath calm, his presence a quiet benediction. Around them, the assembly recognized what the gesture meant, that home was not a place of perfection, but of presence, that belonging was earned through staying. Amy traced her fingers along the restored stone wall, feeling the difference between the old and the new. The ancient mortar had been carefully repointed, the crumbling sections rebuilt using matching quarries. The masons had done their work well, honoring what existed rather than replacing it entirely. The corridor stretched before her, wide enough for two people to walk comfortably, lit by windows whose glass had been replaced after years of neglect. Through them, the afternoon sun cast warm rectangles across the flagstones. She could hear the distant sounds of the castle working around her, footsteps, voices, the clatter of cartwheels in the courtyard beyond. The new library wing is nearly complete, Castian said, appearing at the corridor's end with rolled papers in his hands. Master Cordwain estimates that the archival collection can be transferred within the month. He has trained 3 young scholars in his methods. They are already proving more capable than he is at the actual physical work, though he remains invaluable for interpretation and guidance. Amy took the plans he offered, spreading them across a newly installed reading table. The Harrowell estates spread across the parchment in careful detail fields, farms, the slowly rebuilding manor at the center. What had begun as simple restoration had become something larger. And Emery, she asked, how is he managing the dual administrative responsibility? They currently well. Castian's mouth curved. He has moved into the North Territories 2 days each week to oversee the Harrowell household management directly. He says it is keeping him younger than he would be if he remained here. I suspect he and Morel are planning something, Amy said. As do I, though neither has confirmed it. The sound of brisk footsteps announced Morel before she appeared around the corner, her apron dusted with thread clippings, her braids neat despite the day's work. The ceremony preparations are complete, she reported. The great hall will be decorated by evening. The feast preparations are underway. Guests have begun arriving. Amy folded the plans carefully. Thank you, Morel. You'll want to change soon, Morel added, her gaze lingering on Amy's practical clothes with gentle criticism. The guests will expect her. Let her wear what she chooses, Castian interrupted quietly. Morel's expression softened. Of course, I'll see to the rest. That evening, candles burned in the great hall, their light catching the flowers woven through the rafters. The assembly gathered household members, council supporters, local folk whose lives had improved with the estate's recovery. Amy stood beside Castian at the head of the room, her green gown simple but dignified. I commit to partnership, Amy said, her voice steady, to shared stewardship, to building something that honors what was lost and creates what can be chosen. Castian took her hand. I commit to the same. Together. Before them, Hob rose from his place by the hearth, gray-muzzled now, his movements slower, and walked between them, pressing his scarred body against their legs. The 3-legged hound sat, his breath calm, his presence a quiet benediction. Around them, the assembly recognized what the gesture meant, that home was not a place of perfection, but of presence, that belonging was earned through staying.